Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Prelude to Blitzkrieg, the 1916 Austro-German Campaign in Romania, by Michael B. Barrett, narrated by David Vries. Preface. Although every war has its iconic imagery, none matches the grim horror of the Western Front during World War I. Materialschlacht was the German term for the carnage, a word as brutal-sounding as its portrayal of industrial-scale slaughter. Trenches, barbed wire, poison gas, artillery barrages, and machine guns mowing down mud-soaked millions formed the landscape of the Western Front. Capping the picture are aristocratic officers living in luxury, far from danger, indifferently sending soldiers to their deaths just to capture a few feet of ground. This familiar picture of stalemated armies, however, depicts the war in the West, where by late 1914 trenches ran in solid lines from the Swiss-German-French border junction to the English Channel in Belgium. In the East, the picture was quite different. There were trenches, to be sure, but the vast area meant that these took the form of local fortifications. Maneuvering, from the first clash in 1914 to the last blows in 1917, was a normal feature of battle. Fighting often took the form that pre-war theorists had envisioned: bold, rapid movements of infantry turning enemy flanks, with cavalry conducting reconnaissance or providing a screen of cover for advancing infantry. Infantry remained the queen of the battle by virtue of its mobility, which translated into speed. A speed that allowed a determined attacker to outflank or penetrate enemy positions before reserves could be brought to bear. Infantry that outran its artillery support quickly perished, a development that required the gunners to match the pace of the infantry. Even cavalry remained useful in the East, where the open spaces allowed the exploitation of a breakthrough and the rapid pursuit of a retreating foe. Speed was the elixir of success. In Transylvania and Romania in 1916, the nature of combat bore a greater resemblance to the opening moves of World War II, a decisive period of rapid movement and battles called the Blitzkrieg by the Allies, than it does to the stereotype of World War I, with trenches and deadlock. Hitting where least expected and advancing without the fixation on protecting exposed flanks so endemic in the West, the German Ninth Army defeated two Romanian armies inside Transylvania, poured over the formidable Carpathian Mountains onto the plains of Walachia, rolled up the entire Romanian army from west to east, and drove the shattered remnants against Russia within 4 months. The rate of advance of the Ninth Army in Transylvania in September or across Walachia in November to December 1916 compares favorably with the heady days, for the Germans, of the Blitzkrieg in 1939 to 1940. Of course, Blitzkrieg is not a term associated with World War I. Ironically, the Ninth Army was led by General Erich von Falkenhayn, sacked as Chief of Staff of the Prussian Army on the eve of the campaign in August 1916, owing to the perception that his strategy of attrition in the West and failure to pursue a decisive victory in the East had created a debacle. Given the opportunity in Romania to salvage his reputation, von Falkenhayn grasped the imperative for speed. Winter came early in the Carpathian Mountains, and unless he drove the Romanians back and secured the passes through the mountains before weather shut down operations, the Romanians would remain on Austro-Hungarian territory until well into 1917. Von Falkenhayn had few troops at his disposal, and, at least initially, his forces would be outnumbered. Getting reinforcements from the other theaters of the war would take weeks. In addition, the projected theater of operations in Romania sat at the edge of the least developed and most remote region of Austria-Hungary, Transylvania, compounding the logistical problems of mounting a campaign. Against all odds, von Falkenhayn succeeded brilliantly, proving himself to be a master of operational warfare as his soldiers smashed through the Carpathian Mountains and raced across Walachia. The chimera of open warfare that so tantalized the leaders on the Western Front was the norm in the East, raising the question, Which front was the true face of war, the stalemate in the West, or the vast battles of open warfare characteristic of the Eastern Front? For the man who had the task of rebuilding the shattered German army after the war, General Hans von Seeckt, operations in the Eastern Theater provided the answer and illustrated the nature of future combat. Following his participation in the Marne campaign of 1914, von Seeckt served exclusively for the rest of the war in the East. In May 1915, as Chief of Staff in August von Mackensen's 11th Army, he directed the impressive breakthrough at Gorlice Tarnów. For the next 6 weeks, the 11th Army rolled across the foothills of the Beskidan and northern Carpathian Mountains, forcing the Russians to evacuate Galicia and eventually Poland. Over 250,000 Russians were captured. In the fall of that year, again as von Mackensen's Chief of Staff, but this time at the level of Army Group, von Seeckt directed 3 armies into Serbia and chased the Serb forces into Albania and Greece within 3 months. In 1916, he became Chief of Staff of Army Group Archduke Karl, the senior Austrian headquarters in the southeast Balkan region. That group directed much of the campaign in Romania in 1916. Von Seeckt became disenchanted during the war with the German fixation on enveloping the enemy, a tactic driven into a generation of staff officers by the late Chief of the General Staff, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, 1833 to 1913. He had seen the stalemate that arose when going around an enemy flank took too long and forfeited surprise, or when it could not be done at all. In such cases, the general cannot simply declare that he is at wit's end. He will be acting quite in the spirit of Count Schlieffen, if, with a clear objective in view, he launches his masses at the most effective point. A breakthrough would allow the successful attacker the same opportunity as an envelopment to operate in the enemy's vulnerable rear areas. Present at the most decisive operations of the East, von Seeckt observed firsthand the achievements of fast-moving combined arms operations that either broke through the enemy's lines or went around them, but that in all cases came to operate in his rear areas, surprising him and cutting the vital lines of communication to his frontline forces, leaving them paralyzed. During the Romanian campaign of 1916, von Seeckt and his Austrian commanders at Army Group Archduke Karl exerted little real authority over the determined and headstrong von Falkenhayn or von Mackensen operating in Bulgaria. Nonetheless, von Seeckt had a front-row seat on an operation that exemplified many of the hallmarks of the philosophy and tactics he incorporated after the war when in command of the Reichswehr, tactics that, when fully developed in the late 1930s, became known as the Blitzkrieg. This book is not, however, about von Seeckt and the development of Blitzkrieg tactics in the post-war German Reichswehr. The historians James Coram and Robert Citino have done groundbreaking work there. Instead, this book focuses on a relatively significant campaign that is little known in the English-speaking world, made more important by the employment of what later formed Blitzkrieg tactics. Among these were mobility, speed, combined arms operations, and risking exposed flanks, all in an effort to gain entrance to the enemy's rear area so as to paralyze him or neutralize his ability to react. In such a fashion, a smaller but better-led force could defeat a much larger one. There has been a renaissance in scholarship on World War I over the last 30 years, but more remains to be learned about the war in the East. Indeed, a definitive account of the Eastern Front does not yet exist. There are several reasons for this. Despite the massive scope of the war in that arena, to say nothing of the enormity of the theater, in the long run, the decision came in the West. In addition, revolution, German post-war Freikorps adventures in the Baltic, civil war, and continued fighting kept the area in turmoil longer than in the West, obscuring the picture. The emergence of new states and post-war boundaries, especially after World War II and the ensuing Cold War, often blocked access to sources for decades. Elimination of those borders and 20 years of scholarly interaction have now made possible detailed examinations of the Eastern Front. It is hoped that from studies like this, focused on specific campaigns, a full-bodied picture will begin to emerge. National, state, and regional boundaries and names of places in Southeast Europe have changed many times since 1916, presenting the historian with a bewildering and often confusing set of options from which to choose. Occasionally, the warring parties agreed on the same name for a location or place, but usually they did not, each having its own name for the same place or region in its own language that was not simply a transliteration from one alphabet to another. The Germans invariably used the German name, and the Austro-Hungarians, whether Austrians or Magyars, the Magyar name, and the Romanians generally employed their name. For example, von Falkenhayn said Hermannstadt. His Austrian counterpart, General Arthur Arz von Straußenberg, wrote Natseben, and Romanian Chief of Staff General Dumitru Iliescu put down Sibiu. In similar fashion, Kronstadt, Brassau, and Brasov are one and the same in German, Hungarian, and Romanian respectively. Not only was this practice followed by the participants in their documents and by those who wrote memoirs, but in the post-war period, historians followed the same convention. It is a permissible practice to use place names as they appeared in documents, but I have elected to use the current Romanian names. First, contemporary atlases of sufficient detail are hard to come by. Second, with the exception of some of the Dobroja region, all of the places mentioned in this book where the fighting occurred are now in Romania. A listener looking up these locations in a current atlas or on the Internet will find only their Romanian names. Third, switching back and forth from the German, Magyar, and Romanian names as they appear in the original documents and memoirs would cause all but the most dedicated listeners to stop listening. Even the name Romania has gone through several orthographic revisions. At the time of the war, Roumania was common. During the interwar period, Rumania became the norm. In recent years, Romania is at the fore. Walachia is just as often spelled with one L as with two. Moldova can substitute for Moldavia. This book uses Walachia and Moldavia. There is an exception to every rule, and mine to the one about using Romanian place names is to use Bucharest for the Romanian capital rather than Bucharesti. Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia all used the Julian calendar during World War I, which was behind the Western Gregorian calendar by 13 days. In Romania, the war broke out on 14 August, while in Vienna it was 27 August. In citing documents from Romanian and Russian sources, I have adjusted the dates to correspond to the current Gregorian calendar, which is the common practice. This project would not have been possible without the translation work of Lieutenant Iulia Badoi of the Romanian National Police. She was indefatigable not only in translating material, but also in finding some key sources. She made the arrangements to acquire the photographs from the National Library and Romanian National Military Museum, both in Bucharest. Lieutenant Badoi and her father, Valentin Badoi, escorted my wife and me on a wonderful week-long trip through Transylvania and its battle sites. Their love of their country and its history was obvious. Elizaveta Zhaganina went to the Russian Army Archive in Moscow and did the translations for me of General Andrei Medarovich Zayunchkovsky's reports. She had helped me with an earlier book, and her attention to detail was as strong as ever. Military history without decent maps is almost impossible to follow. Larry Hoffman of Paso Robles, California, did the excellent maps for this book, as he had done for a previous work of mine. Sending these maps back and forth across the country for checking and revision is a challenge, even with the Internet, and Larry was always positive and responsive. Dr. Spencer Tucker, the general editor of the series, is a font of encouragement, and Bob Sloan at Indiana University Press and his colleagues did their usual great job for an author. Indiana's copy editor, Gene Ferris, created order in the footnote apparatus and smoothed the rough edges elsewhere. Works of history rely on voices from the past, most often kept in records stored in archives or the memoirs of participants. The author, who tries to put them together, relies on many people. The Internet and computers have radically changed access to archives and documents. The archivists and librarians who respond to email inquiries and who staff the desks in the reading rooms are the foot soldiers of historical research. Researchers can search online from different continents, order documents and books, and find them waiting on arrival in the archive. It is an astonishing phenomenon, and a great pleasure to converse on the Internet with archivists, then fly to Europe and have material sitting on a desk in a reading room, awaiting action once the registration formalities are finished. My sincere thanks to the staffs of the Military and Photographic Archives of the Federal Republic of Germany in Freiburg IB and Koblenz, respectively, the military branch of the Bavarian State Archive in Munich, the Bavarian State Library in Munich, the State Archive of Baden-Württemberg in Stuttgart, the Romanian National Library, the Romanian National Military Museum, the State Archive of the Republic of Austria in Vienna, the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, and the National Archive of England. The assistance of the librarians and archivists at the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, matched that of their colleagues in Europe. As a scholar who has the advantage of a college teaching position, my efforts have been facilitated by colleagues who took over my classes when I left for a research trip or to present a paper at a conference, sounding out some theories or narrations that found their way into this book. The interlibrary loan desk at the Citadel worked its usual magic and located books and articles that I did not think existed in the United States. Several colleagues checked my work or helped correct some bad writing. Rosemary Michaud, who edited a previous book of mine on the German capture of the Baltic Islands, returned to the front lines and earned an oak leaf cluster to her distinguished editing medal. She knows the mot juste and has an eye for the repeated word, the hackneyed phrase, and even the rhythm of sentences. Time and again she would command, "That word stopped me cold. Change it." My Citadel colleague, Professor Kyle Sinisi, helped enormously as well, as he did on an earlier book. They have improved the style of this work. Errors and uninspired prose are mine. The good passages are theirs. International travel and residence while abroad can amass substantial bills quickly. The Citadel Foundation of the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, graciously underwrote many of the trips and expenses involved in conducting the research for this book. Deans Samuel Hines and W.B. Moore, Jr. likewise provided financial assistance. Finally, there is more than comfort in knowing that at the end of a long, bewildering day, or a tiring and frustrating research trip, there is a sanctuary of quiet and tranquility at home, made possible by my wife, Sarah. It is to her that this work is dedicated. Michael B. Barrett, The Citadel, Charleston, South Carolina. 1. Romania enters the war. Opening salvos, 27 August, 1916. At 3 p.m., 27 August 1916, traffic ceased along the 500 miles of the Austrian-Romanian border. The change took a while to register with the Austrian guards because Romanian soldiers initially stopped the flow a dozen miles from their side of the border. The Austrians first noticed things were amiss when scheduled trains failed to appear. They duly reported this troubling development to their headquarters, suspecting and dreading what it probably meant. They did not have long to wait. At 8:45 p.m. in Vienna, Ambassador Edgar Mavrocordato, 1857 to 1934, handed Romania's declaration of war to Count Istvan Burian, 1851 to 1922, the Austrian foreign minister. Mavrocordato knew its contents well. He had kept the document in his safe for several days after it had been hand-delivered from Bucharest in a manner befitting a spy novel. Romanian statesmen had long realized that their cherished goal of liberating their kinsmen in Hungarian-ruled Transylvania could be achieved only if the Allies won the world conflict. After reneging on the late King Carol's pledge to support the Central Powers in the fateful days of July and August 1914, the Romanian government had waited for the opportune moment to enter the war. while its diplomats secured Allied promises to allow Bucharest to annex Romania Irredenta, the Austro-Hungarian province of Transylvania. In the late summer of 1916, a combination of Allied military success with a concomitant teetering of the Central Powers and Allied pressure indicated to Romania that the moment when her intervention might tip the balance had arrived. The declaration of war minced no words. Romania sees itself forced to place itself at the side of those who would be able to assure the realization of its national unity. Officials in Vienna immediately relayed the news to the Army Field Headquarters in Teschen, on the Eastern Front in Austrian Silesia. There, General August von Kramon, 1861–1940, the German liaison officer, called his own nearby headquarters in Pless to pass on the bad news. The duty officer summoned the Army Chief of Staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, 1861–1922, to the phone. At 8:45 this evening, von Kramon reported, the Romanian ambassador to Vienna handed the Austro-Hungarian government a declaration of war. "Impossible!" cried von Falkenhayn. "It's a fact, Excellency," insisted von Kramon. Von Falkenhayn immediately called Kaiser Wilhelm II, 1859–1941, who was equally stunned. The news hit him like a bolt from the blue. He told General Moritz von Linke, 1853–1932, head of the military cabinet, that this means the end of the war. Up to the moment of the declaration, the Kaiser believed it impossible that Romania's King Ferdinand, 1867–1927, a German from the Catholic branch of his own Hohenzollern family, and a sovereign who had pursued a policy of neutrality since Romania defected from its alliance obligations at the war's onset, would go over to the enemy. Although Romania's perfidy and disavowal of blood ties shocked the Kaiser, von Falkenhayn was not totally taken aback. Romania's timing, more than her declaration of war, had taken him by surprise. Despite warning signs that Romania was gradually tilting toward the Entente, he had given credence to faulty intelligence from the German military attaché and ambassador in Bucharest, and firmly believed that the invasion would not come before the completion of the fall harvest. Von Falkenhayn had nonetheless hedged his bets and consulted with his Austrian counterpart, Colonel General Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, 1852–1925. The two army chiefs had met twice in July to discuss what actions to take in the event that Romania intervened. They faced limited options given the crises on the other fronts of the war. About all they could do was to threaten Romania from Bulgaria, where a small German-Bulgarian army, led by German Field Marshal August von Mackensen, 1849–1945, blocked Allied forces in Thessalonica, Greece, from moving north. A thrust from Bulgaria would almost certainly force the Romanians to pull back some of their units invading Transylvania to defend the capital of Bucharest, dangerously close to the Bulgarian border along the Danube River. The diversion of enemy forces would slow the pace of their advance in Transylvania, permitting Austria and Germany to assemble sufficient units in northern Transylvania to drive the invaders back over the mountains onto the plains of Walachia. The Central Powers would pursue the retreating enemy and, reinforced by the German-Bulgarian army coming from Bulgaria, crush Romania in a concentric advance on Bucharest. This ambitious plan remained almost entirely on paper. The prevailing wisdom was to avoid provoking the Romanians by reinforcing the border, a step von Falkenhayn found easy to implement because he had no spare divisions to send to the Balkans. The consequences of a Romanian declaration of war were far more serious for the Austrians, and Conrad did take some minor action. He moved his heavy bridging equipment and the Austrian Navy's Danube flotilla to river ports in Bulgaria, opposite Romania. He had already ordered the regional hinterland commanders in Transylvania to prepare for an invasion, telling them to consolidate second-line and militia units that were scattered here and there into coherent combat units. At the end of July, he dispatched 2 divisions to Transylvania, although both came from the Russian front and needed reconstitution and recuperation owing to crushing losses. These were the 51st and 61st Honved, or Hungarian, infantry troop divisions, both in sad shape. The 61st went to Tsikh County north of Brasov, Kronstadt in the Burzenland. The 51st went to Alba Iulia, Karlsburg. The Austrians formed 23 new infantry battalions from reserve units, foraging artillery and miscellaneous equipment from other fronts, and organized these into the 71st and 72nd Infantry Troop Divisions located in Brasov, Sibiu, Hermannstadt, and Petroseni. In one of the subordinate units of the 72nd Division, the 144th Infantry Brigade, coal miners from Petroseni, were formed into several battalions. Hungarian state of siege laws allowed the conscription of people in many professions, including miners, on declaration of war. It is not certain if the miners ever received any military training, but on paper they existed as a unit and were already under martial law, waiting for orders to drop their picks and shovels and move to the front. Conrad did send one first-rate infantry regiment, the 82nd, from his Fourth Army in Russia. The unit's members belonged to the Tsekela population of the Burzenland, a Magyar subgroup living in the southeast apex of Transylvania. Finally, as the signs from Romania grew more ominous, Conrad created an army headquarters, the first, to command this mélange of units, with its area of operations extending from the Danube border with Hungary to the Russian front in the Bukovina. He placed Lieutenant General Arthur Arz von Straußenberg, 1857 to 1935, in charge on 7 August 1916. Born in Sibiu, Arz proved a good choice. Good-humored, he was liked by both the Germans and his Austrian superiors. Possessed of an affable personality that successfully sought compromise, he had had assignments in the management and personnel branches of the General Staff rather than taking the more customary route to general officer rank via the Operations Division. When the war broke out, he held the rank of Major General and headed the administrative section of the War Ministry. Nevertheless, he asked for a field command in August 1914. He commanded an infantry division in the Battle of Komorov, but the grim hand of Darwinist laws led to many changes at the top of the Austrian forces, and he took charge of the 6th Corps by September 1914. He was still commanding the 6th Corps when Conrad moved him to Transylvania in August 1916. Political reasons as well as Arz's military talent were responsible for his selection. Arz was the first Austrian commander in the war to receive Prussia's coveted Pour le Mérite medal, which he earned for leading the 6th Corps in the Gorlitza-Tarnów campaign as part of von Mackensen's 11th Army. The ability to work with von Mackensen was important, as Conrad anticipated that the field marshal would be in charge of all the troops in Siebenbürgen, the southern region of Transylvania bordering Romania, as well as of the Bulgarians and forces south of the Danube. Arz reported to Conrad for guidance in early August, en route from Russia to Transylvania. He received precious little. The chief never mentioned that he had worked out a tentative plan with his German counterpart. Conrad simply told Arz that Romania's entry into the war was a certainty. She had virtually mobilized her forces and had some 400,000 soldiers on active service, and Arz could expect an invasion at any moment. Armed with that cheery news, Arz reported next to Hungarian Prime Minister Count István Tisza, 1861 to 1918, who also expressed his conviction that a Romanian invasion was imminent. That nation's mercurial Prime Minister Ion I.C. Brătianu, 1864 to 1927, had again declared Romania's neutrality, but Tisza scoffed, giving no credence whatsoever to that assertion. Arz arrived in Cluj-Napoca, Klausenburg, on 14 August. Awaiting him was Colonel Josef Huber, 1864 to 1944, his chief of staff, who had traveled directly from Russia to Siebenbürgen, and he brought the general up to date. Huber knew that the High Command wanted the First Army to delay for as long as possible while withdrawing from the mountain border regions to prepared positions along the line of the Mureș, Maros, and Tarnava-Cocal valleys. A lengthy withdrawal would give the Central Powers the time needed to send reinforcements for the next phase, throwing the Romanians from Transylvania. The alternative strategy of abandoning the eastern half.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?